In the spring of 1887, a four-man survey party rode north out of Clarendon, Texas, carrying transit instruments, a chain, a set of iron survey pins, and a contract to run boundary lines along the eastern face of the Caprock Escarpment. Their foreman was a man the county records call Emmett Cauley, 31 years old, formerly of the Texas Rangers Frontier Battalion, hired that season by one of the land syndicates carving the last of the panhandle into fenced sections. The work was routine. Run the line, set the pin, note the elevation, move to the next station. It was the kind of labor that had already been done across 10,000 square miles of Texas that decade, and there was nothing in the contract that suggested this particular stretch of ground was any different from the last. 3 weeks after they rode out, their wagon was found abandoned at the mouth of a narrow break in the escarpment wall, the mules still in harness, the fire cold, the men gone. No bodies were ever recovered. No further entry was ever made in the survey log. The break in the Caprock, where the wagon stood empty, is still known to a handful of ranching families in the area by a name that has nothing to do with any surveyor. They call it the Warned Canyon, and the story of why carries a warning that, according to local memory, had already been given to Cauley's party before they ever reached it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what happened at the mouth of that canyon, you have to understand what the Caprock actually is and who had walked its ground before any survey crew arrived. The Llano Estacado, the staked plains of the Texas Panhandle, ends abruptly along its eastern edge in a wall of rock and red clay that in places drops 300 feet in a matter of yards. This is the Caprock Escarpment, and it is not one clean line but a broken series of canyons, draws, and box breaks cut by centuries of runoff into the softer earth below the harder Caprock layer. Palo Duro Canyon lies along this same escarpment system, and so do dozens of smaller, unnamed canyons that never made it onto any tourist map. For the Comanche people, and before them for other plains groups who used this ground, these breaks were not empty land. They were water sources in a country where surface water was scarce for most of the year. They were shelter from the wind that runs across the staked plains with almost nothing to slow it. They were winter camps, hunting ground, and in more than one documented instance, they were the sites of engagements during the long conflict between the United States Army and the Comanche and their allies that finally ended with the surrender of Quanah Parker's band at Fort Sill in the spring of 1875. The country the Comanche called their own before the reservation era covered a vast stretch of the southern plains that later generations of historians would name the Comancheria, and the eastern face of the Llano Estacado sat near its northern edge. Bands moved seasonally between the open plains above the Caprock, where bison herds grazed through summer, and the sheltered canyons below it, where horses could be wintered out of the wind and water ran even in dry years from springs that never showed on any Anglo survey map until decades later. Quanah Parker himself, whose mother Cynthia Ann Parker had been taken captive as a child and raised among the Comanche before her own recapture by Texas forces in 1860, is recorded as having used canyon country very near this stretch of the escarpment as a refuge during the final years of Comanche resistance, before the destruction of the Comanche horse herd at Palo Duro Canyon in September of 1874 broke the last organized resistance on the southern plains. That single documented event, an army column under Ranald Mackenzie capturing and then destroying more than 1,000 Comanche and Kiowa horses at Palo Duro, is often cited by historians as the effective end of Comanche military capacity to resist removal to the reservation. It happened less than 15 miles from the break where Cauley's crew later vanished. By 1887, the Comanche had been confined to reservation land in Indian Territory for 12 years. But confinement on paper did not mean the ties to this ground had been severed in 12 years of memory. Ranchers across the Panhandle recorded, in letters and in later oral histories collected by local historical societies, that small groups of Comanche continued to travel south from the reservation in certain seasons, sometimes with permission, sometimes without, to visit specific places along the escarpment that held meaning that had nothing to do with grazing rights or mineral claims. One of those places, according to the oral history preserved by at least 2 ranching families whose land bordered the break where Cauley's wagon was found, was a canyon the Comanche called by a name that translates roughly to the place of the drowned fire, a reference, the story goes, to an engagement during the Red River War in which a Comanche band was caught in the canyon during a flash flood while trying to evade a cavalry patrol. Whether that engagement happened exactly as the story describes it cannot now be confirmed. No official Army after-action report from that campaign mentions a flood in a canyon by that description. But the story was consistent enough and told by enough separate families independently of one another that by the time surveyors began working the eastern Caprock in the 1880s, local ranchers already knew there was one particular break that Comanche visitors, when they passed through, avoided entering and warned others away from as well. The land rush that put Cauley's crew on that ground had a name and a paper trail that is easy enough to verify. In 1882, the Texas legislature contracted with a syndicate of investors, later organized as the Capitol Freehold Land and Investment Company, to build a new state capitol building in Austin in exchange for more than 3 million acres of public land in the Panhandle. The arrangement became known locally as the Capitol Syndicate deal, and the land itself would eventually become the XIT Ranch, at the time the largest fenced ranch in the world. Before any fence could go up, the land had to be surveyed, section by section, and that work fell to dozens of small crews contracted out across multiple seasons through the middle 1880s. Cauley's party was one of those crews, working a section of the survey that had been assigned, deliberately or not, to the same stretch of escarpment the ranching families already knew to avoid. Survey work of this kind followed a fixed procedure that had changed little since before the war. A crew ran a transit line from a known reference point, usually a section corner already established by an earlier government survey, and set an iron pin or a mound of stacked stone at each new corner, recording the compass bearing, the distance in chains, and any notable natural feature, a creek crossing, a rock outcrop, a stand of timber, in a field book that the syndicate's chief surveyor in Fort Worth would later use to draft the finished plat. A 4-man crew was standard for this kind of work, 1 man on the transit, 1 on the chain, 1 setting pins and building corner mounds, and a 4th handling the camp, the stock, and the supply runs back to the nearest trading post. Cauley's crew matched that pattern exactly, and the syndicate's own field instructions for that season, portions of which survive in later Fort Worth Land Office correspondence, specify that no section was to be left unsurveyed without the chief surveyor's written authorization, a requirement that would have made it difficult for Cauley to simply route around the canyon the way Holt was asking him to, even if he had wanted to. According to the account passed down through the family that ran cattle nearest the site, a rancher named Presley Holt rode out to the survey camp roughly a week before the crew disappeared. Holt had grown up on that section of the Caprock, had traded with Comanche families as a boy during the brief periods when trade was permitted, and had heard the story of the drowned fire more than once from men who had no reason to invent it for an outsider's benefit. Holt's account, preserved by his descendants and repeated in at least 1 local historical society publication compiled decades later, says he warned Cauley directly against running the survey line through that particular break, and that Cauley, polite but unmoved, told him the contract did not allow for skipping ground because of a story. Holt reportedly left the camp uneasy. He would later tell his own children that he had ridden away that afternoon certain he would not see the crew again, though he could not explain, even to himself, why he was certain of it. Holt was not the only person in the area who is remembered as having tried to warn the crew. A land office clerk working temporarily out of a supply store near Clarendon, whose name survives in local memory only as Dorsey, is said to have overheard Cauley discussing the assignment before the crew rode out, and to have mentioned, almost in passing, that his own Comanche trading contacts had specifically named that canyon among the handful of places along the escarpment they would not enter after dark under any circumstance. Dorsey's account, if it was ever written down at all, has not survived in any form beyond the version retold by his own descendants 2 generations later, and it should be weighed with the same caution as every other piece of this story that exists only as memory. What makes it worth including is not that it proves anything on its own, it is that it shows the warning was not confined to one family's recollection. By the time Cauley's crew rode north, at least two separate sources, unconnected by blood or business, remembered telling him or someone in his party the same thing, that the canyon at the mouth of that particular break was one the Comanche had marked as dangerous long before any survey line ever touched it. Cauley himself was not entirely a stranger to this kind of country or its dangers. Before taking the surveying contract, he had spent 6 years with the Texas Rangers Frontier Battalion, patrolling this same stretch of the Panhandle during the final years when small Comanche parties still occasionally crossed south from the reservation without permission. Men who served alongside him, in recollections collected decades later, describe him as capable, unshaken by isolated country, and not a man given to superstition of any kind, which is part of why Holt's warning is remembered as having made so little impression on him. He had faced real conflict on that same ground and walked away from it. A story about a canyon, however consistently told, was not the kind of danger his years in the battalion had trained him to take seriously, and there is no indication in any surviving account that he gave Holt's warning a second thought once the rancher had ridden off. The other 3 men are harder to trace than Cauley himself. Fragments of the syndicate's payroll records list them only as J. Whitfield, A. Monroe, and a fourth hand paid under the name Tom Ray, with none of the further identifying detail that would let a modern researcher trace their families forward with any confidence. Whitfield is remembered through the same oral tradition that carried Holt's account, as the youngest of the 4, not yet 20, hired on for his first full surveying season that spring. Monroe had worked 2 previous seasons for the same syndicate crew farther north along the escarpment. Of Tom Ray, nothing beyond the payroll entry itself has ever surfaced. Whatever any of them knew or suspected about the canyon ahead of them, whatever they might have said to their own families before riding north, went with them into that break and did not come back out. What happened to Emmett Cauley's crew inside that canyon has never been established by any surviving official record, and it is worth being direct about that absence rather than filling it with invented certainty. The county in which the canyon sits was not formally organized with its own courthouse and its own filing system until several years after 1887, and the nearest functioning county seat at the time was more than a full day's ride away. A search party, organized by the syndicate's local land agent, once the crew failed to report for 2 consecutive weeks, found the wagon, the mules, the cold fire, and the crew's personal effects still rolled in their bedding, as though the men had simply stepped away from camp for a moment and never returned. The search party's own report, according to the land agent's later correspondence, which survives in a private collection rather than any government archive, does not describe tracks leading away from the camp in any direction. It does not describe signs of a struggle. It describes an absence, complete and unremarked upon, as though 4 men and their equipment had simply stopped being present. The land agent's letter, along with a handful of other documents connected to the syndicate's operations in that section, was donated to a small regional historical society by a descendant in the 1960s. It is one of the only pieces of contemporary paper that mentions the disappearance at all. The state and county archives that would ordinarily be expected to hold a missing persons report, a coroner's inquest, or a follow-up investigation contain nothing on the matter, and there is a mundane explanation available for that gap as well. The courthouse serving the region during its first decades of organization burned in a fire in the early 20th century, a fate that befell dozens of county courthouses across Texas during that period, and any records generated in the intervening years between the disappearance and the fire, if they were ever filed at all in a jurisdiction still finding its footing, did not survive. This is not a case where a clean record was suppressed. It is a case where the frontier bureaucracy simply may never have produced one, and where the one that might have been produced burned along with everything else in the courthouse that year. The search itself, as it has been passed down, took the better part of 4 days. The land agent's party rode the length of the section Cauley had been contracted to survey, working backward from the last recorded pin the crew had set, a corner mound of stacked caliche rock, roughly 2 miles short of the canyon mouth. From that last mound onward, there was no further pin, no further mark on the ground, nothing to show the line had ever been continued. The party followed the natural route into the break, the only practical way in for a wagon, and found the camp exactly as later accounts describe it, undisturbed, unhurried, as though the men had simply set down their tools mid-task. 2 of the searchers reportedly refused to ride farther into the canyon once they reached the camp, and the party that did continue on foot for perhaps another half-mile found nothing further, no second camp, no equipment cache, no sign that the men had gone on ahead to set additional pins before whatever happened to them occurred. The search was called off before nightfall on the 4th day, and it was never resumed. The syndicate itself treated the loss as a business matter and little more. Surviving correspondence between the land agent and the syndicate's Chicago office refers to the missing crew mainly in terms of replacing the contract and absorbing the cost of lost equipment, with no instruction on record to pursue the matter any further once the 4-day search was called off. 4 men, in the ledger the syndicate kept of that season's operations, became a line item rather than a case. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What survives instead is the story itself, carried by the ranching families who lived closest to the ground and who had no particular reason to embellish an account that made their own section of the Panhandle sound less safe to settle, rather than more. The version most consistently told describes the search party approaching the mouth of the canyon at dusk, the mules standing quiet in their harness as though nothing at all was wrong, and one member of the party, a young hand working for the Holt family, later saying that the canyon itself felt wrong in a way he never found words for afterward, a stillness that had nothing to do with wind or temperature, and that made every man in the party want to be somewhere else before dark. Whether that detail belongs to the original account or was added by a later generation of storytellers cannot be sorted out at this distance. Oral history does not preserve perfectly, and every family that tells this story tells it slightly differently, which is itself one of the reasons to treat it as legend rather than as an established sequence of events. But the core of it, the wagon, the missing crew, the canyon the Comanche had already named for a drowning, and the syndicate's determination to survey it anyway, appears in every version, and appears in family accounts that were, as far as can be determined, recorded independently of one another before the story had any chance to circulate as a single unified tale. There is a more grounded explanation available for what may have happened to Cauley's crew, and it deserves to be laid out alongside the legend rather than dismissed in favor of it. The canyons of the Caprock Escarpment are cut through soft caliche and gypsum-bearing clay, and that geology produces genuine hazards that have nothing to do with any curse. Flash floods on the staked plains can move an enormous volume of water through a narrow canyon in a matter of minutes, arriving from a storm system that may be miles away and entirely out of sight of anyone standing at the canyon floor. Gypsum deposits throughout the region are also known to dissolve slowly underground, producing sinkholes and collapsed caverns that can open without warning beneath ground that looked solid the day before. A 4-man crew working the canyon floor, caught by a flash flood originating in a storm system to the north or by a sudden ground collapse, could plausibly have been lost entirely, swept downstream or buried, with a wagon and mules left standing untouched at the canyon mouth if the men themselves had already gone in on foot to set survey pins deeper in the break. This explanation requires no ancient warning and no unexplained stillness in the air. It requires only the ordinary, well-documented dangers of the terrain, dangers that local families, including the Comanche families who had lived alongside that canyon for generations, would have understood intimately enough to explain in the form of a story about a drowned fire and a place best left alone. The Llano Estacado had already unsettled outside travelers 3 centuries before Cauley's crew rode onto it. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado's expedition crossed this same tableland in 1541, searching for the legendary cities of Quivira, and Coronado's own chroniclers described plains so featureless above the caprock that men left behind to guard supplies had to be found again using piles of bison dung stacked at intervals, since no landmark on the flat plains above offered any other way to retrace a path. It was only at the broken edge of the escarpment, where the canyons cut down into shelter and water, that the country became legible again, and every group of outsiders who came onto this ground before or since, Spanish, Anglo, or otherwise, learned to read that broken edge by relying, whether they admitted it or not, on the accumulated knowledge of the plains people who already lived along it. Both explanations point toward the same practical conclusion, which is that the Comanche warning, whatever its origin, was rooted in something real about that ground. Whether the danger was a specific historical tragedy remembered in a place name, or simply the accumulated knowledge of a people who had watched that particular canyon flood and collapse and take lives long before any survey crew arrived to test it for themselves. The Syndicate never returned a crew to complete that section of the line. Later survey maps of the area show a gap where Cauley's section should have been recorded, filled in eventually by a different crew working from the opposite direction, who by every account gave the canyon itself a wide berth and ran their line around it rather than through it. Whether that decision was made out of respect for the story, out of simple caution after hearing what had happened to the first crew, or out of the same practical unwillingness to risk men and equipment in a known flood hazard, none of the surviving correspondence says directly. But the gap in the survey map is real, and it sits exactly where the story says it should. The Caprock is not alone in holding a canyon with this kind of reputation. Ranching families along other sections of the same escarpment system, in the counties to the south and west, tell similar stories about specific breaks and draws marked off by Comanche or Kiowa warning long before Anglo settlement, most of them tied, on closer examination, to the same kind of flash flood or sinkhole hazard present in the warned canyon. Tule Canyon, a few dozen miles to the south, carries its own local reputation as dangerous ground, reinforced in the historical record by the same 1874 campaign that broke Comanche resistance at Palo Duro, when Mackenzie's column destroyed the captured horse herd there rather than attempt to drive it back to a fort. These parallel stories do not prove anything about Cauley's crew specifically, but they suggest a broader pattern, that the plains people who lived along this escarpment for generations before any survey line was run through it had accumulated a working knowledge of its genuine hazards, and passed that knowledge on in the form of place names and warnings rather than maps and written reports, because place names and warnings were the form of record their culture actually kept. The canyon carries at least one other entry in local memory beyond Cauley's crew, and it is worth setting alongside the first because it involves no legend at all, only a flood that nearly everyone in the area over a certain age can still describe. In the summer of 1937, a ranch hand from the same family that had warned Cauley took shelter from a sudden storm inside the mouth of the same break, unaware, by his own later account, that he had ridden into the canyon the old stories warned against. The storm that afternoon dropped several inches of rain in under an hour on ground miles upstream from where he sat, and the wall of water that came down the canyon floor afterward, described by the man himself in an interview recorded by a local newspaper decades later, arrived without any warning sound ahead of it. No distant thunder, no rise in the creek, simply a wave of brown water filling the canyon floor from wall to wall in what he estimated to be under 2 minutes. He survived only because his horse bolted for higher ground on its own before he had fully understood what was happening. He did not go back into that canyon again for the rest of his life, and he told the story, according to his family, not as proof of any curse, but as plain evidence that the old warning had never needed a curse to be true. The last corner mound Cauley's crew is remembered to have completed, a stack of caliche stone roughly 2 miles short of the canyon mouth, was relocated by a regional surveying historian in the 1990s using the Syndicate's original field notes as a guide. He found the mound still standing, weathered down to little more than a low scatter of rock, but recognizable against the surrounding ground by its regular, deliberately stacked shape. A small piece of physical evidence that the crew had in fact been exactly where the story says they were, doing exactly the work they were sent to do, right up until the point where the record and the stones both stop. The canyon itself is still there today, on private ranch land that has stayed in the same family for 4 generations, and the family that owns it has, according to more than one regional newspaper feature written over the decades, never allowed drilling, fencing, or development inside the break itself, citing the story as their reason without elaborating much further than that. A descendant interviewed for one such feature in the 2000s said that every child in the family is taken to stand at the mouth of the canyon at some point growing up, and told, plainly, why the ground beyond that point is not to be entered alone and never during or after rain, regardless of how clear the sky may look at the moment. Whether that instruction is understood within the family as a literal warning, a practical one, or simply a tradition too old to need justifying, the descendant did not say, and by her own account, did not feel any need to settle the question one way or the other. Hunters and hikers who have gone in with permission over the years describe it as an unremarkable canyon by daylight, dry most of the year, prone to sudden and dangerous flooding during the rare hard rains that hit the panhandle in late summer, and otherwise indistinguishable from 100 other breaks along the same escarpment. A handful of them have also described, independently and without prompting from one another, the same instinctive unease the young search party hand is said to have described in 1887, a wrongness in the stillness of the place that dissipates the moment they climb back out onto the flat ground above. No bones, no rusted transit instrument, no fragment of Cauley's survey chain has ever been recovered from inside the canyon, despite periodic searches by amateur historians and at least one documented attempt by a university archaeology field team in the 1980s. That team, working under a standard permit to survey Panhandle Canyon systems for evidence of earlier plains occupation, spent parts of 2 field seasons cutting shallow test trenches near the canyon mouth and along its first bend. Their published findings, which focus mainly on stone tool fragments and hearth features consistent with much older Comanche and pre-Comanche use of the site, note in passing that the sediment layers in several of their trenches showed clear evidence of repeated, high-energy flood deposition, thick bands of mixed gravel and clay laid down quickly rather than accumulated slowly, consistent with the canyon having flooded catastrophically on more than one occasion over the preceding centuries. The team's report does not mention Cauley, the survey crew, or the 1937 flood at all, since none of that history fell within their research permit, but the physical picture it describes, a canyon capable of burying material many feet below its current floor, within a matter of minutes, lines up precisely with what would be needed to erase a 19th century camp without leaving a trace. That absence is, in its own way, consistent with either explanation. A flood violent enough to bury 4 men and their equipment would leave exactly the kind of erased, undisturbed silence that the search party found when they arrived at that empty camp at dusk, mules standing quiet, fire cold, nothing left to say what had happened except the ground itself, closed back over whatever it had taken, the way it is remembered to have done at least once before, long before Emmett Cauley ever rode out from Clarendon with a contract in his saddlebag and a warning he chose not to listen to. The family that has held the land for 4 generations has, in more recent decades, also made a point of maintaining contact with the Comanche Nation's Cultural Preservation Office in Oklahoma regarding the site, an arrangement one family member described in a regional feature article as a matter of simple courtesy rather than any formal agreement. A cultural liaison who visited the property in the early 2000s is quoted in that same article, confirming that the canyon's old name and the story attached to it were consistent with accounts still held by Comanche families today, though the liaison was careful to note that the tribe does not maintain an official position on what happened to any 19th century survey crew, only that the ground itself had long been regarded as a place to avoid. That distinction matters. The warning predates Cauley by generations and would have existed whether his crew had ever ridden out or not. What his disappearance did was give the warning a second story to travel alongside the first, one written in English rather than passed down in Comanche, and one that has, in its own way, kept the older story alive, far longer than it might otherwise have survived among ranching families, with no particular reason to remember it after the land was fenced and the Comanche families stopped coming south. By daylight in a dry season, the canyon gives up nothing. The walls run red and pale gold in the late afternoon light, the same as any other break along this stretch of escarpment, and a visitor who did not already know the name would have no particular reason to feel anything unusual standing at its mouth. It is only with the first distant rumble of a summer storm, or with the particular stillness that settles over the plains above the Caprock in the hour before dusk, that people who know the story say they understand, if only for a moment, why the warning was given in the first place, and why a family that has owned this ground for 4 generations has still never once tried to prove it wrong. Regional historians who study Panhandle folklore point out that Cauley's crew represents one of very few documented survey party disappearances anywhere in the multi-year Capitol Syndicate project, a project that employed hundreds of men across 3 million acres without, as far as surviving records show, any comparable loss. That rarity is part of why the story has endured while so many other frontier hazards of the same decade were logged, resolved, and forgotten. The Warned Canyon does not appear on any modern topographic map under that name. It is known that way only to the family that owns the ground, and to the handful of local historians who have spent time collecting the story from the families who kept it. The line Emmett Cauley was contracted to run still shows its gap on the surviving syndicate survey documents, a silence in the paperwork that has outlasted the courthouse fire, outlasted the syndicate itself, and outlasted every man who rode out with Cauley that spring. Whether the ground took them through flood, or through something the ranching families never tried very hard to put into ordinary words, the canyon has kept its own account of what happened, and it has never been made to give that account up. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.